Sold to the Duke of Alistair. The auctioneer's voice, slick with commercial triumph, sliced through the grimy air of the debtor's hall. The words struck Lady Seraphina Thorne with the force of a physical blow, stealing the very breath from her lungs. She stood on the raised platform, a spectacle of fallen nobility, her worn dress a testament to the year of ruin that had followed her flight from the altar. Across the sea of leering faces, she met his gaze. The Duke. He stood tall and unmoving amidst the squalor, his tailored coat a stark slash of midnight blue against the room's decay. There was no pity in his eyes, no flicker of the warmth she remembered from a lifetime ago. There was only the cold, hard glint of possession. He had not come to save her, she thought, a wave of ice washing through her veins. He had come to own her. The gavel fell with a crack that echoed the shattering of her last fragile hope. The sound seemed to freeze the moment in time, sealing her fate in the sudden ringing silence. All the whispers, the snickers from the assembled merchants and opportunists, faded into a dull roar in her ears. The only thing that felt real was the weight of the Duke of Alistair's stare. A gaze that pinned her in place, branding her as his property. 100 frantic questions screamed within the confines of her mind. Why? Why would the man whose reputation she had single-handedly destroyed, the man she had publicly humiliated in the most unforgivable way, now purchase her indenture? This could not be mercy. It felt like the final, perfect act of a long-simmering revenge, a way to exert absolute control over the woman who had dared to defy him. Her mind recoiled from the cold steel in his gaze, pulling her back from the precipice of the present and plunging her into the memory of the night it all began. The night the storm outside her window was but a pale reflection of the tempest in her heart. Her mind took her back to that rainy night 1 year ago, to the eve of what was meant to be her wedding day. The halls of Thorne Manor, already stripped of their finest tapestries to pay her father's gambling debts, felt cavernous and cold. She had been on her way to her chambers, the fine silk of her wedding gown, a ghostly presence in the adjoining room, when she heard the low murmur of voices from her father's study. It was the clink of crystal against crystal, a celebratory sound that made her pause. She pressed her ear to the heavy oak door, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. "To a masterful plan, Harrington," her father, Baron Thorne, was saying, his voice thick with brandy. "And to my daughter, Seraphina. Her sacrifice will restore the Thorne name and then some." A sneering laugh answered him, a sound she recognized as belonging to the odious Lord Harrington, a man whose presence had been a constant, unnerving shadow in their home for months. "She will play her part beautifully," Harrington replied. "Alistair is besotted. He sees a meek, biddable little dove. He will never suspect that his blushing bride is the key to his undoing. Once she is his duchess, you will have his ear, my dear Baron. You will advise him on investments. The South Seas shipping venture I've devised. It will look impeccable on paper." Seraphina felt the blood drain from her face. She knew of her mother's secret ledgers, of the lessons in finance her mother had pressed upon her in secret, calling it her true dowry. She understood what Harrington was implying. A fraudulent scheme. He will pour a fortune into it, Harrington continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And when the company inevitably collapses, his fortune will be ours. He will be ruined, and we shall be the richest men in England." The mighty Duke of Alistair, brought to his knees by the woman he trusted. The room swayed. This was not about saving their family. It was about destroying another. It was about using her, and the genuine, tender feelings she had begun to develop for the stern, honorable Duke, as a weapon. In that moment she saw her future not as a duchess, but as a Judas. Her choice was clear and terrible. She could walk down the aisle to save her father from debtor's prison, or she could disappear and save the man she was supposed to marry from utter ruin. As the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, she slipped out of the manor with nothing but a small purse and the clothes on her back, leaving behind a legacy of shame to protect a man who would only ever know her as a coward and a traitor. The cobblestones of London were a far cry from the manicured gravel paths of her father's estate. They were slick with refuse and a perpetual greasy dampness that seeped through the thin soles of her boots. Here, the name Sarah, the identity she had hastily adopted, was a ghost. The name Seraphina, the daughter of Baron Waltham, was less than a ghost. It was a meaningless collection of syllables. The grand titles and ancient lineages that had once dictated every breath she took were worthless currency in the shadowed alleys where survival was the only trade. She found work where she could, each job a fresh layer of humiliation that stripped away another piece of the woman she had been. In a steamy laundry, her arms submerged in scalding water, she scrubbed the fine linens of ladies who might have once been her acquaintances. The lye bit into the soft skin of her hands, leaving them red and cracked. The beginnings of calluses, a permanent testament to her fall. In a crowded tavern near the docks, she wiped down sticky tables, her head bowed low as sailors and laborers jeered, their coarse laughter a stark contrast to the polite titters of a ballroom. She learned to move with averted eyes, a phantom in her own life. The loneliness was a physical presence, a cold stone lodged in her chest. It ached most acutely in the cramped, mildewed room she rented under the eaves of a dilapidated boarding house. The walls were thin, and she could hear the arguments of her neighbors, the cries of their children, the simple, brutal symphony of lives lived in close quarters. She had no one. She was an island, and the sea around her was a roaring, indifferent city of millions. Once a woman she vaguely recognized from a past season, the daughter of a minor viscount, had entered the tavern. Their eyes had met for a fleeting second, a flicker of confusion, then dawning recognition, then pure, unadulterated scorn had passed over the woman's face before she turned away with a contemptuous sniff. That single silent judgment had been more painful than any shouted insult from a drunkard. To be seen and found wanting by the world she had fled was a special kind of torment. Then came the winter. It was a season of brutal, unrelenting cold that seemed to suck the very life from the cobblestones. Her meager savings evaporated, spent on a threadbare blanket and a few lumps of coal that did little to fight the chill seeping through the cracks in the wall. Her work at the tavern grew sporadic as fewer patrons braved the icy streets. Hunger became a familiar, gnawing companion, a hollow ache that echoed the one in her soul. Her descent was a slow, inexorable sinking, marked by a wet cough that rattled in her chest and fever dreams that plagued her fitful sleep. In them, her mother's calculating eyes and Harrington's smug smile swirled into the stern, honorable face of Alistair, only for it to morph into a mask of betrayal as he looked at her. She would wake shivering, the line between this chaotic montage and her waking reality blurring into a single grey misery. One particularly bitter morning, she could not rise from her cot. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion held her pinned. The weak dawn light filtering through the frost-rimed window offered no comfort. She stared at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city awakening without her. This, then, was her end, not a grand tragedy, but a slow, anonymous demise in a rented room that smelled of damp and despair. Her great sacrifice, her flight to save a duke, felt like the most profound foolishness. He had likely married some other suitable, biddable girl from a respectable family. He was safe in his palatial home, warm and prosperous, and had probably forgotten the name Seraphina Waltham entirely. Her noble act had saved him, but it had delivered her to this, a forgotten statistic, a body to be discovered by a weary landlord. She closed her eyes, the effort of keeping them open too great. The cold was no longer just around her, it was inside her. A crystalline stillness spreading through her veins. She had thought she was saving him from ruin, but as she lay there, drifting, she wondered if she had merely traded his potential destruction for her own certain one. The thought was her final bleak companion before the darkness at the edges of her vision swallowed her whole. The darkness that had swallowed her was not the eternal kind. It was a thick, cloying thing, pierced by the scent of onion broth and the low, rhythmic murmur of a voice she did not know. Seraphina surfaced not to the grey misery of her rented room, but to a fragile, warm lucidity. A woman with hands gnarled like old tree roots and eyes the color of a winter sky was spooning warm liquid into her mouth. The broth was a tether, pulling her back from the precipice. "There now, dearie," the woman clucked, wiping Seraphina's chin with a surprisingly soft cloth. "Old Bess won't let a bit of damp and chill take a strong young thing like you. Not on my watch. Bess, the seamstress, and her landlady had found her, dragged from the edge of that crystalline stillness by sheer stubborn kindness. Her recovery was a slow, humbling crawl. Days bled into one another, marked only by the bowl of broth, the cup of bitter tea, and the gradual, grudging return of strength to her limbs. As the fever dreams receded, her gaze would often fall upon the small, scarred trunk at the foot of her bed, the cold, hard proof of her sacrifice. It was a far quieter companion than the memory of Alistair's betrayed face, but it echoed the same profound foolishness, a shared sediment at the bottom of her heart. It was on a day when she could finally sit up without the room spinning that her eyes fell upon the trunk. It was a small, travel-worn thing of scarred leather and tarnished brass, given to her by her mother years ago for her future travels. She had always thought it a final bitter joke. Now it sat in the corner of Bess's sparse, clean room, a relic of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. With effort, she dragged it toward the cot. The familiar, faint scent of cedar and lavender, her mother's scent, rose from it, a ghostly presence that tightened her throat. She opened it, her weak fingers brushing past the few practical dresses and meager possessions she had packed for her flight. Her hands traced the faded silk lining, remembering her mother's precise, almost severe instructions on how to pack it. A place for everything, and everything in its place. Her fingers caught on a nearly imperceptible ridge along the bottom, a seam that was too straight, too perfect. Curiosity, a sensation she had not felt in weeks, flickered to life. Using a hairpin Bess had left on the washstand, she worried at the edge. With a soft, definitive click, a section of the trunk's false bottom lifted. Her breath hitched. This was not a space for hidden jewels or love letters. There were no glittering trinkets to be pawned. Instead, she found a stack of papers, neatly tied with faded ribbon. The first was a ledger, its pages filled not with the sprawling, dramatic script of her mother's social notes, but with columns of tight, meticulous numbers. It was a record of income and expenses, but not for the household. These were entries for S. W. Holdings, Serafina Waltham. Beneath the ledger was a deed. The paper was old but preserved, granting ownership of a property known as the Gables, 14 Elm Street, to one Miss Serafina Waltham, the transfer date from one Mr. Alaric Finch, occurring over 5 years prior. A small forgotten property in the city. Her mind raced, trying to place it, to recall any mention of it, but there was none. The final document was a portfolio, a detailed list of modest but shrewd investments. Small shares in a shipping consortium, a stake in a Midlands wool mill, bonds in a nascent railway company, all made in her name, the capital seemingly drawn from an account she never knew existed. The initial sums were not vast, but the returns, carefully reinvested over the better part of a decade, had grown into a quiet, self-sustaining fortune. The realization did not dawn. It crashed over her, a wave of cold, shocking clarity. Her mother, the consummate social climber, the woman who had bartered her daughter's future for a title with calculating eyes, had been playing a deeper, far more dangerous game. She had not been securing a noble match for her daughter, she had been securing an escape route. A merchant's daughter herself, she had understood the fragility of titles and the permanence of capital. She had seen the gilded cage for what it was and had, in secret, been fashioning a key. A wet, ragged sob escaped Serafina's lips, but it was not born of the despair that had so recently cradled her. It was a storm of conflicting emotions, grief for the woman she thought she knew, fury at the years of performance, and a terrifying, burgeoning sense of power. Her great sacrifice for Alistair, her flight into poverty and anonymity, had been based on a lie of omission. Her mother had given her the tools for independence, but had never trusted her with the knowledge, perhaps fearing she would lack the nerve to use them at the crucial moment. She was not a forgotten statistic. She was a property owner, an investor, a woman of independent, if hidden, means. The cold stillness inside her did not vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer the chill of death, but the sharp, clear cold of a winter morning after a storm. She looked around the sparse room, at the frost on the window, and saw it not as a prison, but as a temporary shelter. She had thought her story was a tragedy of noble ruin. She saw now it was something else entirely. It was a story of a legacy, hidden in plain sight. And as her fingers tightened around the deed to the Gables, Seraphina Waltham, for the first time since she had fled Harrington's offer and Alistair's judgment, began to plot her next move. It would not be a move of a desperate woman, but of a calculating one. Her mother's daughter, after all. The fire in the small hearth spat and crackled, its feeble warmth no match for the glacial certainty that had settled in Seraphina's bones. The initial storm of grief and fury had passed, leaving behind a landscape scoured clean, sharp and stark, under a new sun. The despair that had crippled her had not vanished, but it had been reforged in the crucible of her mother's secret. It was now a cold, hard resolve, a blade honed for a singular purpose. She was no longer just a survivor, clinging to the wreckage of her former life. She was the keeper of her own destiny, the executor of a hidden will. The sparse room with its peeling plaster and the persistent scent of damp wool was no longer a prison cell. It was a command post. The deed to the Gables and the small leather-bound ledger were her maps to a new world. For hours she pored over her mother's meticulous script. The columns of numbers, the lists of investments in trade ships and modest manufactories, the quiet, consistent growth of capital. It was a language she had been forced to forget, the vernacular of her girlhood before the title of lady had sanded down her edges. Her father, a man of commerce, had indulged his bright daughter, teaching her the basics of ledgers and percentages. That knowledge, long dormant and deemed useless for a noble wife, now reawakened with a vengeance. It was another key her mother had left for her, polished and ready. The realization should have been a fresh wave of fury, but instead it settled into a cold, clear certainty. Her mother had orchestrated her entire sacrifice, not out of cruelty, but from a profound mistrust. She had needed a pawn whose desperation would be absolute, whose defiance would be unshakable because it sprang from genuine ruin. Now, armed with the truth of the safety net she had never felt, Seraphina saw not a tragic past, but a new battlefield. Her mother had gambled on her ignorance. Now that knowledge itself became her most potent weapon. Now, with everything to lose again, but on her own terms, her defiance would be absolute in a different way. She would not simply reclaim the life she had lost. That gilded cage held no allure for her anymore. She would dismantle it. Brick by gilded brick, she would tear down the men who had destroyed her and expose the rotten truth festering beneath the veneer of honor. Lord Harrington, with his lecherous proposals and his casual power, who had seen her not as a person, but as a beautiful acquisition for his collection, and Alistair. Her breath hitched. Alistair, whose judgment had been the final crushing blow. He had looked at her, at the story Harrington had so cleverly spun, and had believed the worst. He had seen her desperation and called it guilt. His rejection had been the final anchor dragging her into the abyss. Her fight was no longer just for herself. It was for the honor of the man she had saved, the man Alistair had believed her to have betrayed. Lord Thorne, a man of genuine integrity, had been the target of Harrington's plot, a man set up to take the fall for embezzlement to clear the way for Harrington's own ambitions. Seraphina had intercepted the falsified documents, but in doing so had placed herself in a compromising position that Harrington had been all too ready to exploit. To save Thorne, she had to let Alistair believe her faithless. It was a choice that had cost her everything. Now she would reclaim that sacrifice. She would prove that her silence had not been complicity, but a weapon she had chosen to wield, however blindly. A plan began to form, not in a hot rush of vengeance, but with the cool, deliberate pace of a master strategist. She was her mother's daughter, after all. The hidden capital was her army. The Gables, a modest but respectable property a day's ride from the city's gossip, would be her base of operations. It was not about hiding anymore. It was about building a new identity, one with the financial footing to move in circles where whispers could be gathered. And influence, however subtle, could be purchased. She looked at her reflection in the dark, frost-rimed window. The face that stared back was thinner, harder, the softness of her youth carved away by hardship. But the eyes, once pools of wounded confusion, now held a glint of pure, undiluted steel. She was Serafina Waltham, no longer a lady, but a force of reckoning. She would use the very tools of commerce and capital her mother had secured to destroy the world of titles and appearances that had sought to break her. She folded the deed and tucked the ledger into the folds of her worn dress. The first move was simple. She would leave this room at dawn, not as a fugitive, but as a woman with a destination. She would travel to the Gables, assess her new domain, and from there begin the meticulous work of ruin. The game was afoot, and for the first time she held all the best cards, hidden neatly up her sleeve. A grim, purposeful smile touched her lips, a foreign and thrilling sensation. Let them think her defeated. Let them think her gone. It was in the silence before the storm that the most careful plans were laid. The name, Mrs. Serafina Wren, felt like a shroud, a necessary garment of drab wool that concealed the gleaming steel of her true purpose. It was a name chosen for its forgettability, and the modest dark dress and simple bonnet that completed the disguise were its perfect accompaniment. The funds, meticulously counted from the hidden inheritance, were not for finery, but for access. A small, rented room in a respectable but unremarkable boarding house on the fringes of the city became her new headquarters, a far cry from the opulent prison of her father's townhouse. Her days took on a new, deliberate rhythm. Each morning she would venture out, a widow of quiet means, her movements a study in unassuming grace. She found her way to the bustling coffee houses that served as the unofficial exchanges for the merchant class. The air was thick with the scent of roasted beans, cheap tobacco, and the aggressive perfume of ambition. Here, amidst the clatter of porcelain and the low hum of negotiation, she learned to listen. She would sit in a corner, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold before her, her ears straining to separate useful fragments from the cacophony. She heard the names first. Waltham and Harrington were spoken not with aristocratic reverence, but with the wary respect men afford a dangerous, profitable beast. She learned of her father's heavy investments in a consortium of East India merchantmen, a venture touted as certainty itself. Lord Harrington, she gleaned, was the silent, majority partner in a scheme to enclose common lands north of the city, a project mired in legal ambiguities but propelled by sheer political force. They were building their fortunes on a foundation of speculation and influence, a house of cards painted to look like stone. But Serafina was not content with the whispers of merchants. She knew the true archives of society's secrets were not in ledgers, but in the servants' halls. Dressed in her most worn gown, she would linger near the tradesmen's entrances of grand houses, particularly those of her father's known associates. She learned which scullery maids were sweet on which grooms, which butlers frequented which public houses. A carefully placed shilling, a sympathetic ear offered to a harried maid carrying a heavy market basket, could yield more intelligence than a week in a coffee house. It was through a talkative laundress, her hands chapped and red, that Serafina learned of the special accounts. The woman, employed by a household that managed some of Lord Harrington's more discreet affairs, complained of the head housekeeper's foul temper, which was always at its worst when his lordship's man comes with the private books. The ledgers, she grumbled, were kept separate from the household accounts, filled with cryptic entries and payments to names that never appeared on the guest lists. Piece by piece, the mosaic of their corruption took shape in her mind. She began to track their investments with the cool detachment of a general surveying a battlefield map. Her mother's ledger, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her room, became her Rosetta Stone. She cross-referenced its lists of hidden assets with the ventures she now knew they were pursuing. She realized her father was dangerously over-leveraged, his visible fortune a fan-made propped up by loans against his future shares in the India venture. Harrington was more cunning, his wealth diversified, but his reputation brittle, reliant on the success of the land enclosures. A failure in either venture would not merely be a financial setback. It would be a catastrophic unraveling. One evening, hunched over a small table in her room, she made her first move. Using a disguised hand, she penned a carefully worded letter to a minor, but notoriously litigious, landholder whose property was adjacent to Harrington's enclosure project. The letter, purportedly from a concerned fellow landowner, did not accuse but merely pointed out the obscure, almost forgotten clause in the ancient land charter that might complicate any attempt at enclosure. It was a single small stone dropped into a still pond. She had no proof it would work, but she understood the nature of men like Harrington's partners. They were bulls, and the slightest flicker of a red flag could send them into a panic. She sealed the letter, her hands steady. This was not the hot, satisfying strike of a sword. It was the patient, invisible application of pressure to a fault line. She looked at her reflection in the small, warped mirror above her washstand. Mrs. Serafina Wren stared back, her face pale and composed. But deep within the grey eyes of the widow, Serafina Waltham watched, waited, and calculated the precise moment to let the whole corrupt edifice crumble under its own weight. The game was indeed afoot, and her next move was already taking form, a cold, sharp plan being whetted in the silence of her modest room. The days following the dispatch of her letter were a study in excruciating stillness. Serafina Wren performed her duties at the milliner's with an automaton's precision, her mind a world away from ribbons and lace. She watched the post, scanned the society pages for any ripple of financial distress, and listened to the gossip of the city with a hunter's focus. For a week there was nothing. The stone, it seemed, had sunk without a trace. A cold knot of doubt tightened in her stomach. Had she overestimated the litigious landholder's resolve? Had the clause been too obscure? Then a crack appeared. Mr. Abernathy, the milliner, mentioned offhandedly that his brother, a clerk in the Lord Mayor's office, had spoken of a sudden, furious dispute over some land to the north. "Lawyers swarming like wasps from a kicked nest," he'd said, shaking his head. "Something about an old charter. Nasty business." Serafina had merely nodded, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The stone had not been lost. It was now creating concentric circles, invisible to most, but unmistakable to her. It was in this tense period of waiting that her quiet investigation led her to Mr. Alistair Davies. Her path to him was circuitous, traced through the labyrinthine notes she had pilfered from her father's study. She found his name linked to a minor but telling lawsuit against a Harrington-controlled company, a case Davies had lost, but not before filing a brilliantly scathing and ultimately ignored brief on the illegality of the company's founding charter. He was, according to the notes of her father's own solicitor, troublesomely clever, but lacking in both means and connections. She found his office tucked away in a warren of lanes near the Inns of Court, a single room above a chandler's shop that perpetually smelled of tallow and dust. He was a young man, perhaps only 5 years her senior, with ink-stained cuffs and a gaze that was both weary and acutely intelligent. When she introduced herself as Mrs. Wren, a widow seeking discreet financial consultation, his initial politeness was tinged with skepticism. Widows were not typically his clients, and they certainly did not arrive with such specific, complex questions about corporate law and leveraged assets. His skepticism turned to open shock when she, with a calm that belied the risk, laid out a hypothetical scenario that mirrored Harrington's land enclosures with unnerving accuracy. She spoke of ancient charters, of bulls and red flags, of applying pressure to fault lines. He listened, his pen stilling on the blotter. "How is it that you, a woman, come to know of such things?" he finally asked, his voice low. Serafina met his gaze, the grey eyes of the widow steady. "The world is not kind to widows, Mr. Davies. It falls to us to understand the mechanisms of cruelty, lest we be crushed by them." It was then that she played her final card. She mentioned the specific Harrington scheme that had nearly ruined his family, the one that had forced his father into debtor's prison. She watched the colour drain from his face, the professional composure shattering to reveal the raw, personal bitterness beneath. "I do not come to you with mere hypotheticals," she said softly. "I come to you with a name, Harrington. And I believe you and I share a common desire to see a measure of justice served." For a long moment, the only sound was the distant clatter of a cart from the street below. Mr. Davies looked at this pale, composed woman who spoke of financial ruin and vengeance with the dispassionate air of a general planning a campaign. He saw not a hysterical female seeking retribution, but a formidable intellect. The shock gave way to a dawning, fierce respect. He agreed. Not for payment, she had little to offer, but for the chance, however slim, to be the instrument of his own justice. He would become her discreet and loyal ally, her agent in a world that would never accept a woman conducting such business. He would make the investments, file the inquiries, and provide the respectable male face her clandestine operations required. Their partnership was forged in that dusty room. He was initially taken aback by the depth of her financial knowledge, her instinct for the vulnerabilities of powerful men, but he quickly came to see her not as an anomaly, but as a master strategist. He brought the letter of the law. She brought a profound understanding of its spirit, and of the corrupt hearts that sought to twist it. Under her direction, he began using her small, pooled resources, the widow's mite, she called it with a wry smile, to make quiet, counterintuitive investments. He bought minuscule shares in companies that stood to benefit if Harrington's India venture faltered, and made discreet inquiries about the solvency of the banks that had loaned so heavily to her father. One evening, as they pored over a list of her father's creditors, Davies looked up at her, his expression grimly admiring. "You are not merely aiming to ruin them financially, are you, Mrs. Wren?" Serafina's gaze was fixed on the window, watching the gas lamps flicker to life in the gathering dusk. "A financial ruin can be recovered from, Mr. Davies, with enough time and fewer scruples. I am aiming for a conflagration. I want the debt cold at the worst possible moment. I want the partners to panic and turn on one another. I want the facade of their respectability to shatter so completely that everyone can see the rot within." She turned her head, and the lamplight caught the cold, sharp glint in her grey eyes. "My father built his fortune on a foundation of other people's broken dreams. It is only fitting that his end should be the same." The plan was being whetted, its edge growing keener with every passing day in the silence of their shared resolve. Her first move was calculated and precise, a surgical incision into the edifice of Harrington's ambition. Through a labyrinth of intermediaries constructed by Mr. Davies, she anonymously bought up a controlling interest in the Pembroke Mill, a small but venerable textile works in Manchester that Harrington had been methodically cornering. His plan was a classic of its kind: acquire, asset strip and sell the husk, leaving the workforce destitute and adding a tidy sum to his war chest for the India venture. It was the sort of casual destruction her father had always applauded as sound business. Serafina, however, saw the mill not as a collection of assets, but as a living entity. Under the guise of a newly formed holding company, the Arachne Trust, she directed a quiet revolution within Pembroke's soot-stained walls. Mr. Davies, acting as the Trust's sole visible agent, implemented a series of modernizations that were both humane and ruthlessly efficient. He commissioned the installation of new, safer looms, improved ventilation to combat the suffocating mill fever, and offered a modest profit-sharing scheme that transformed the sullen, exhausted workers into a fiercely loyal and productive workforce. The cost was a fraction of the loss Harrington would soon incur, but the value it generated was more than financial. It was a testament to a different philosophy, When the mill's quarterly reports were published, they revealed a dramatic, unexpected surge in productivity and profit. The value of Pembroke Mill stock, which Harrington had been buying up cheaply in anticipation of its collapse, tripled almost overnight. His scheme to asset strip it was now financially impossible. To acquire it would cost him a fortune he had already mentally spent elsewhere. The loss was significant, a deep, painful gash in his liquidity. The move sent a small anonymous ripple through the financial world. In the hushed, cigar-smoke-filled rooms of London's clubs, men murmured about the Arachne Trust and its puzzling, counterintuitive strategy. It was a warning shot, fired from the shadows. Alistair Harrington received the news in his office, his face mottling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He stormed into Lord Wren's study, brandishing the financial papers like an accusation. Some damned philanthropic society has sunk its teeth into Pembroke. He snarled, tossing the broadsheet onto the desk. It's a fluke, a bizarre anomaly. Throws my calculations for the quarter entirely out of alignment. Lord Wren leaned back in his leather chair, a condescending smile playing on his lips. He swirled the brandy in his snifter, the liquid catching the firelight like liquid amber. Calm yourself, Alistair. The market is full of such eccentricities. Idealists with more money than sense. They burn through their capital on foolishness like improved latrines for mill workers and are inevitably ground into dust by the real engines of commerce. Do not dignify it with your concern. It is a gnat buzzing at the ear of a lion. Their arrogance was a shield, and Serafina, watching from the periphery through Davy's detailed reports, was pleased to see it was a shield of paper. They dismissed the event as a fluke, a statistical ghost. Their blindness was her greatest asset. In the weeks that followed, the silence in the dusty room where she and Davies conspired was filled with the quiet rustle of paper and the sharp scratch of his pen. The widow's mite was growing, the returns from Pembroke being meticulously reinvested. Davies had procured a large slate board, and on it he had begun to map the intricate web of her father's and Harrington's financial interests. It was a spider's web of interlocking directorships, cross-collateralized loans, and leveraged investments, all centered on the towering, precarious spire of the India venture. It is not one debt, but a cascade, Davies explained one evening, his finger tracing a line from a London bank to a shipping consortium. They have used the same assets as collateral for multiple loans. The India scheme is the keystone. If it is perceived to be in jeopardy, he let the sentence hang in the air, heavy with implication. Then the entire arch collapses. Serafina finished, her voice soft. She stood and walked to the slate, her grey eyes scanning the complex diagram. She reached out and, with a piece of chalk, drew a small X on a seemingly minor investment trust listed among her father's holdings. This one, the Northumberland and Tyne Investment Trust. What do you know of it? Davies adjusted his spectacles. It is one of your father's older ventures. Holds a portfolio of coastal shipping and minor mining interests. Moderately profitable but largely stagnant. Why? It is sentimental, she said, a cold, knowing smile touching her lips. He started it with his first major profit. He considers it his lucky charm. He would hate to see it tarnished. A new light of understanding dawned in Davies's eyes. The strategy was evolving. It was no longer just about striking at the most vulnerable points, but at the most cherished ones. The financial ruin was the body of their downfall, but she was now aiming for the heart. We will not touch it directly, she instructed, turning from the board. But find me a way to make it a liability, a small persistent drain, a leak in his lucky ship. As Davies set to work, Serafina allowed herself a moment to look out the window. The city below was a tapestry of light and shadow, each flickering gas lamp representing 1,000 unseen dramas, 1,000 struggles for power and survival. She was one of them now, a weaver in the dark. Her first move had been a success, but it was only the opening gambit. The board was set, the players entrenched in their delusions of invincibility. The next move would need to be quieter still, a poison seeping into the roots, invisible until the very moment the great tree began to fall. The conflagration would not start with a roar, but with a single, carefully placed spark in a place they would never think to guard. Lord Harrington stared at the financial broadsheet spread across his mahogany desk, his face a thundercloud. The ink seemed to bleed, the numbers a testament to the gall of some unseen adversary. The setback in the Argent Valley Railway shares was more than a financial loss. It was a personal insult, a gauntlet thrown down in the heart of his own domain. "It has to be Thaddeus Blackwood," he growled, crumpling the edge of a paper. "That old badger has been sniffing around my northern shipping lanes for months. He thinks he can pinch a few shares, create a scare, and force me to the table. He underestimates my resolve." Baron Thorne, swirling a glass of amber brandy by the fireplace, nodded in grim agreement. "Blackwood has always been cautious. This is uncharacteristically bold. But you are right, Alistair. It reeks of a direct challenge. We cannot appear weak. We must answer in kind, and with such force that he, and any other vulture circling, will think twice ever again." Their shared delusion was a fortress, its walls built from arrogance and patriarchal certainty. The world of high finance was a gentleman's game, a brutal chess match between men of stature. The thought that the architect of their irritation was the very woman they had cast out, the daughter Harrington had deemed a frivolous distraction, never once breached the battlements of their minds. Seraphina was a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in drawing rooms, not a player on the board. Their underestimation of her was a worm in the woodwork, silent and undetected, already gnawing at the foundations of their empire. "Then we double down," Harrington declared, his fist connecting with the desk. "The Opheria deal. We accelerate the timeline." Thorne's eyes gleamed with avaricious light. The Opheria venture was their masterstroke, a scheme to consolidate a near monopoly on a newly discovered mineral essential for a revolutionary new alloy. It was also a house of cards, built on leveraged capital, whispered promises to Parliament, and the systematic undermining of smaller, legitimate claim holders. "We'll need to secure the final tranche of investment. It's a risk given this irritation with the railways." "A risk is what separates kings from paupers, Thorne," Harrington retorted, his confidence returning, fed by his own bluster. "We will be bolder. We will be brasher. We will make it so overwhelmingly profitable that Blackwood and his ilk will be left choking on our dust. Their cautious whispers will be drowned out by the roar of our machinery." And so they plunged deeper. Their meetings, once held behind the discreet closed doors of their clubs, now took on a new, careless audacity. They were seen in public restaurants, their heads bent together over prospectuses, their loud, confident laughter a signal to the world of their unshakable position. They spoke in veiled but decipherable terms about imminent windfalls and paradigm shifts, drawing the attention of smaller, more impressionable investors eager to ride their coattails. In their certainty, they failed to notice the subtle shift in the air, the way some of the older, more cautious money at the exchange had begun to quietly distance itself, sensing the recklessness that often preceded a great fall. Meanwhile, in the quiet book-lined study that served as her war room, Seraphina received Davies's reports. They were not delivered by messenger, but through a series of dead drops and coded messages that would have seemed absurdly theatrical to her father. To her, they were the bare minimum of operational security. "The Opheria venture," Davies confirmed, adjusting his spectacles as he decoded the latest missive. "They are moving with unprecedented speed. Lord Harrington is leveraging assets even I was not fully aware of. He is staking everything on it." Seraphina listened, her expression impassive. She stood before her chalkboard. But the X on the Northumberland and Tyne Investment Trust remained the quiet, pulsing center of her strategy. "And our little leak. Proceeding as planned," Davies assured her. "A minor but persistent liability. A shipping contract for the trust, negotiated at a suspiciously favorable rate, which is now incurring hidden docking fees at a port we control. A small failing tin mine within the trust's portfolio, which we have quietly ensured fails to meet its safety inspections, requiring costly, unexpected upgrades. The leaks are small, drips in a vast ocean, but they are constant. He will not notice them until his attention is diverted elsewhere and the bilge is already flooded." A cold smile, a mere ghost of an expression, touched Seraphina's lips. Her father, in his frantic, bullish charge toward the grand prize of Opheria, was ignoring the sentimental, the foundational. He was fortifying the castle walls, while the well within was being slowly poisoned. She turned from the board and walked to the window. The city sprawled beneath her, a living entity of ambition and decay. Down there, her father and Thorn were moving their gilded pieces with loud, triumphant shouts, believing they were mastering the game. They did not understand that the true game was played in the silence between the moves. Their brazenness was a gift, painting a target on their backs for every rival and regulator, while her own efforts were a subtle venom, introduced into the bloodstream of their empire with the delicate precision of a physician. The conflagration she had promised herself would not start with a roar. It had already begun. The first spark had been the railway setback, a flicker to draw their gaze. The next was the quiet, insidious corrosion of his lucky charm, the Northumberland and Tyne. And the Opheria venture, their great triumph, was being expertly guided by their own arrogance into the position of the kindling. They were stacking the wood for their own pyre, all the while boasting about the magnificent bonfire they would soon light. Seraphina, the weaver in the dark, simply had to ensure that when the match was struck, the flames would consume everything they held dear. The blueprint for ruin was complete, its lines drawn not in ink but in the invisible currents of capital and influence. In the quiet of her study, Seraphina and Mr. Davies moved from architects to engineers, their tools ledgers and telegraphs instead of trowels and timber. The information they had siphoned from her father's frantic, cornered maneuvers was a detailed map of his desperation. Harrington, emboldened by the perceived momentum of the Opheria venture, was preparing his masterstroke, a massive, fraudulent investment scheme to be unveiled at the most public of venues, the Duchess of Beaumont's annual masquerade ball. "He believes the spectacle will lend his fiction an air of legitimacy," Mr. Davies murmured, his finger tracing a column of figures that told a story of breathtaking audacity. "He will promise returns woven from Ophirian gold, using the venture's grand reputation as collateral for a lie." Seraphina's gaze was cool, analytical. "Then we must ensure the collateral is called in at the precise moment he attempts to spend it. The foundation must crumble as he places the final stone on his tower of deceit." The plan they devised was a thing of delicate, malicious beauty. Over the next fortnight, through a labyrinth of anonymous brokers and shell corporations registered in faraway ports, Seraphina began a series of orchestrated financial movements. It was a symphony of betrayal played in a minor key. Small, seemingly insignificant blocks of stock in the Northumberland and Tyne were quietly sold, creating a barely perceptible dip in its value. Simultaneously, using capital funneled from the very trust accounts she had been secretly leeching, she initiated large, anonymous purchases in a handful of obscure industrial concerns. A Belgian lens maker, a Chilean nitrate processor, companies that were, on paper, unrelated to Harrington's empire, but were, in fact, critical single-source suppliers for the Opheria project's infrastructure. Her actions were not those of a saboteur swinging a hammer, but of a sapper in the tunnels, carefully replacing solid earth with sand. She was creating a financial paradox. The trust's flagship mine would show subtle weakness, while its grand new venture would appear to have sparked unexpected, bullish interest in its peripheral partners. It was a configuration designed to baffle and then to break. The final piece was a complex web of put options, bets against the trust's core holdings, all timed to mature in the 48 hours following the ball. The moment Harrington stood before London's elite and announced his grand scheme, the market, guided by her invisible hand, would receive a series of contradictory signals that would resolve into a single, catastrophic conclusion, a coordinated, devastating loss of confidence. "The House of Cards will not simply fall," Seraphina stated, her voice devoid of triumph, only finality. "It will implode. The pressure from without will be nothing compared to the vacuum within." With the financial trap set, there remained the personal theatre. She required a stage front seat. An invitation to the Duchess of Beaumont's masquerade was a coveted prize, a token of social arrival. For Seraphina, it was a tactical objective. She could not rely on her father's waning favor, nor did she wish to. Instead, she deployed a different kind of currency, sentiment. She paid a call on Lady Agatha, the Duchess's spinster sister, a woman known for her extensive charitable work and her vast collection of rare porcelain. Seraphina did not speak of finance or of her father. For an hour she spoke only of glazes and kiln temperatures, of the subtle differences between Meissen and Sèvres. She listened with genuine interest to Lady Agatha's lament about the difficulties of funding a new shelter for foundling children. Before she left, Serafina made a generous anonymous donation to the cause, a sum that conveniently matched the price of a small, exquisite Sèvres vase she had admired. The invitation, delivered by a footman 2 days later, was a mere formality. The night of the ball arrived, cloaking the city in a velvet darkness, punctuated by the gilded glow of 100 ballrooms. Serafina chose her costume with the same precision she had applied to her financial machinations. She went as Nyx, the primordial goddess of the night, draped in a gown of deep, star-dusted indigo, a silver-threaded net holding her dark hair, her face obscured by a mask of polished obsidian. It was not a costume of beauty, but of power. The power of the void, the silence that existed before and after the brief flare of a star. Or a fire. She arrived fashionably late, when the ball was at its zenith. The Duchess's grand hall was a riot of color and noise, a cacophony of peacocks and pirates, harlequins and queens. The air was thick with perfume and the cloying sweetness of champagne. She moved through the throng like a shadow, unseen, her gaze sweeping the room until she found them. Her father was a gilded bull, dressed as a Renaissance king, his mask unable to contain his bluster. Beside him, Thorn was a Roman emperor, his smile a sharp, predatory thing. They held court, their laughter too loud, their gestures too broad, the epicenter of the room's avaricious energy. They were exactly where she needed them to be, visible, exposed, and utterly convinced of their own invincibility. She positioned herself near a colossal marble pillar, a vantage point that offered a clear view of the raised dais where the orchestra played. She did not dance. She did not drink. She was a monument of stillness in the swirling chaos, a weaver watching the threads of her tapestry begin to pull taut. The first spark had been the railway. The slow poison was the mine. And now here, in this gilded cage of their own making, the conflagration would find its breath. She could feel the weight of the telegrams already sent, the orders ticking silently through the wires toward the stock exchange, a ghost army marching on her command. All that was left was for the king to give the signal that would crown his own destruction. The obsidian mask was still cool and impossibly heavy in her hands, a final mocking echo of the power she had felt weaving its threads in the grand hall. That power had been her undoing. The flare of magic had been a beacon in the night, a sharp crack against her skull, the world dissolving into nothing, and she had awoken here. Now there was no mask. There was only the stark, unforgiving light of the auction house, a place that smelled of dust, desperation, and cheap coal smoke. The champagne and cacophony of the ball were a lifetime away, a dream shattered by the guttural laugh of a man she'd once seen dismissed for stealing silver. Her father's former servant. He had not even confronted her himself, merely scuttled away into the shadows of the costume shop, a rat seeking the favor of a larger predator. The ambush had been swift, efficient, and utterly humiliating. Seized not in some dramatic confrontation, but in a back alley, the silken gown of the void tangling around her legs like a shroud. Her father, the gilded bull, had not even bothered to appear. Harrington Thorn, the Roman emperor, had sent his men. It was, she supposed, a form of respect. She was a business matter, not a familial one. The ride to the debtor's auction was a blur of rough canvas and the scent of unwashed men. They had not bothered to gag her. Her silence was a given, her protests as meaningless as the paper they now claimed defined her worth. The man in the lawyer's suit, his fingers stained with ink, had recited the litany of her financial sins with a bored monotony. The debts of a minor inherited estate, called in with sudden brutal precision. The railway, the mine, all her intricate plans had been predicated on her freedom, on her presence at the ball to guide the final fatal blow. Instead, she was here, the foundation of her revenge crumbling to dust beneath her feet. The auction block was a raised platform of scarred wood, stained with the ghosts of other ruined lives. They had let her keep the simple dark dress she wore beneath her costume, a small mercy that felt like the deepest cruelty. It marked her as common, stripping away the last vestige of the persona she had so carefully constructed. The crowd that milled below was a motley collection of factory foremen, mine owners, and a few sharp-eyed women who ran laundries or brothels. They assessed her not as a person but as an asset. Strong back, young enough, hands that were soft but could be hardened. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like grinding gravel, began his chant. Lot 47, female indentured contract to satisfy outstanding obligations. Educated, sound of mind and limb, prime for domestic service or light industrial work. Do I hear an opening bid? A wave of cold detachment washed over her. This was the end. Not the glorious conflagration she had envisioned, but this sordid, quiet extinguishing. She would be swallowed by some factory, her mind and will ground down to nothing. Her father and Thorn would toast their cleverness, their victory complete. She focused on a crack in the wooden floor, imagining it was a fissure leading down into the earth, a place to hide her shame. The bids came slow and utilitarian. A pittance. Her life, her rage, her entire being was being valued at less than a good plow horse. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the numbness. Then a new voice cut through the grimy air, cold and clear as a shard of ice. It did not shout. It simply stated a figure, a sum that was triple the last bid. A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. Her eyes snapped open, scanning the faces. They parted and her breath hitched in her throat. He stood near the back, a monument of stillness in the shifting throng. He was not dressed for the grime of the auction house. His greatcoat was of finest wool, his boots polished to a military shine. He wore no mask, but his face was a more effective disguise, a landscape of sharp angles and impenetrable reserve. His hair was the color of winter ash, and his eyes, the pale, piercing grey of a stormy sea, were fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. The Duke of Alistair, memories, long buried under the weight of her purpose, surfaced with the force of a tidal wave. A summer garden, the scent of night-blooming jasmine. His quiet proposal offered not with passion, but with a cool, logical certainty that had felt like a cage. Her refusal, sharp and final, a declaration that she would not be another trophy in a cold man's collection. She had chosen a path of her own making, a path that had led her here to this block, before him. The auctioneer stammered, "The gentleman in the back. Most generous offer. Do I hear there were no other bids?" The Duke's presence, his title, the sheer unnerving finality in his gaze, silenced the room. The gavel fell with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. Sold to His Grace the Duke of Alistair. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He merely nodded once. A curt, efficient motion, and a man she presumed was his solicitor stepped forward to handle the paperwork. The Duke's eyes never left her. They held no pity, no warmth, no triumph. Only a deep, unreadable calculation. Two of his men, their demeanor far more disciplined than Thorn's brutes, approached the block. They did not drag her. One simply gestured for her to descend. The numbness shattered, replaced by a fresh, searing horror. This was worse than any factory, any mine. This was a gilded cage of a different sort. One whose bars were forged from her own past failures and his implacable will. He had not saved her. He had acquired her. As she stepped down, her legs trembling beneath her, the Duke finally moved. He walked toward her, his stride measured and silent on the sawdust floor. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe, taking in the simple dress, the disheveled hair, the utter absence of the power she had worn just hours before. His voice was low, meant for her alone, and it chilled her to the bone. "It would appear," he said, each word precise and sharp, "that your plans have undergone a significant revision." The gavel's crack was not an end, but a beginning. A terrible, silent beginning. As the Duke's men, more like automata than men, their movements crisp and devoid of malice or pleasure, gestured for her to descend from the block, Seraphina's body moved on a string of pure instinct. Her legs, treacherously weak, carried her down the rough wooden steps. The sawdust floor, which had smelled of animals and desperation, now felt like the shore of a new and desolate country. The Duke of Alistair closed the distance between them with a predator's patience. The raucous crowd was a muffled, receding thing, their gawking faces blurred into a single grotesque painting. All that existed in sharp focus was him. He stopped before her, not too close, yet his presence invaded the very air she struggled to breathe. His gaze was a physical inventory, a cold, assessing sweep that catalogued the cheap fabric of her dress, the grime on her hands, the wild tumble of her hair. He was not seeing a woman. He was auditing an asset. His voice, when it came, was a low, precise instrument calibrated to slice through any pretense. "It would appear," he said, each word a carefully placed scalpel, "that your plans have undergone a significant revision." The horror of her situation was a live wire in her chest, sparking and sizzling. She was now the legal property of Julian Blackwood, the Duke of Alistair, the very man she had sacrificed her company, her reputation, her very freedom to protect from the vipers in his own boardroom. The irony was a poison that threatened to paralyze her. But as she met his impenetrable gaze, a sliver of defiant strength, honed in the fire of her own ruin, wedged itself beneath her fear. He had acquired a body, a set of skills, a signature on a contract. He had not acquired her mind. She tilted her chin up, a minute gesture, but one that made his eyes narrow almost imperceptibly. "Some revisions are forced upon one, Your Grace," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady, a stark contrast to the tremor in her knees. "Others are merely strategic recalculations." A flicker of something, not interest, but the cold acknowledgement of a countermove, passed through his obsidian eyes. He said nothing. Instead he turned, a silent command in the motion, and began to walk toward a side exit. His men fell into step, one slightly ahead, one slightly behind her, forming a living, unbreachable prison. They did not touch her, but their formation left no doubt there was no escape. They emerged not into the grimy alley she expected, but into a narrow, clean-swept courtyard, where a lacquered black town coach waited, its doors bearing a stark silver crest. It was a vessel of silence and shadow, perfectly suited to its owner. One of the guards opened the door. The Duke paused, his hand resting on the frame, and looked back at her. It was not an invitation. It was an expectation. Swallowing the bitter taste of submission, Serafina gathered the tattered remnants of her dignity and climbed inside. The interior was dim, smelling of aged leather, beeswax, and something faintly metallic like cold steel. He entered after her, settling on the opposite seat as the door clicked shut with a sound of absolute finality. The coach lurched into motion, the hooves of the horses unnaturally quiet on the cobblestones. For long minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. He did not look at her, instead staring out the window at the passing city as if she were already forgotten. This, she realized, was part of the punishment. To be rendered invisible, inconsequential in his presence. It was a game of nerves, and she was perilously close to breaking. She broke the silence, her words a deliberate provocation. "You paid a considerable sum for a secretary, Your Grace. I do hope my penmanship meets your exacting standards." His head turned slowly, his profile sharp in the intermittent gaslight. "I did not purchase a secretary, Miss Valence. I purchased a problem. The bluntness of it was a shock. A problem you willingly acquired." "A contained problem is preferable to a loose one," he stated, his voice devoid of inflection. "You were a variable creating chaos in a system I control. That chaos is now internalized. Then you must know I did not act alone. That the fraud at Harrington Consolidated runs deeper than a single disgruntled partner." She leaned forward, the leather seat creaking beneath her. "Harrington was a puppet. The man pulling the strings is someone you trust, someone very close to you." For the first time, she saw a crack in his impassive facade. It was not surprise, but a swift, dark irritation, like a cloud passing before the sun. "I am aware of the conspiracy, Miss Valence. Your former partner, Thorne, has been most vocal in his attempts to implicate my cousin, Lord Pembroke, in your scheme." Her breath caught. He knew, of course he knew. He was not a man who stumbled in the dark, but his knowledge was a weapon she could turn. Vocal, perhaps, but misinformed, or deliberately misleading. Thorne knows the middleman, not the architect. I, however, have the proof. The original ledger pages, the coded transfer orders, the correspondence that doesn't bear Thorne's name, or Pembroke's, but another. She let the words hang in the confined space, a gauntlet thrown down in the shadows. "It's all safely hidden. A final strategic recalculation." The Duke's expression did not soften. It hardened into a mask of cold fury. He moved with startling speed, not touching her but leaning forward, his presence suddenly filling the entire coach, sucking the air from it. "You will tell me where it is." It was not a request. The fear returned, a cold flood, but she met his gaze, her own blazing with a desperate fire. "No. You may own my indenture, Your Grace, but you do not own my silence. That knowledge is my sole remaining property. You wanted me contained. Then you have contained this too. You have brought the one person who can prove the conspiracy is real, and the one person with the proof, directly into your household. A rather volatile combination, wouldn't you say?" He studied her, his eyes tracing the lines of defiance on her face. The calculation was back, deeper and more dangerous than before. He was no longer looking at a problem to be managed, but at a locked box that might contain either a treasure or a venomous snake. He slowly settled back into his seat, the predatory stillness returning. "We shall see," he said, his voice a low whisper that was more threatening than any shout. "My household has a way of tempering volatile elements. We will resume this discussion when you are more suitably prepared." The coach rolled on, carrying her toward the gilded cage of his world. Serafina leaned back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had drawn a line in the sand of his sawdust-strewn arena. She was his property, yes, but she had just proven she was not powerless. The battle was not over. It had simply changed venues. And the first skirmish, she thought with a surge of grim satisfaction, had been hers. The gilded cage, when it arrived, was not a dank prison, but a monument to cold power. The Duke's London residence was a palatial expanse of pale stone, its windows like 100 judging eyes. Serafina was led not to the scullery or the servants' quarters, as her indenture would suggest, but through a labyrinth of opulent corridors to a pair of towering mahogany doors. The footman who escorted her opened them without a word, and she stepped into the Duke's inner sanctum. His study was a study in controlled intimidation. Walls of leather-bound books rose to a shadowed ceiling, and a massive desk of obsidian wood dominated the room, its surface bare save for a single pristine ledger. A fire crackled in the marble hearth, its warmth failing to reach the chill that emanated from the man himself. He stood before it, his back to her silhouetted against the flames. He did not turn as she entered, forcing her to stand in the echoing silence, the only sound the hiss of the logs and the frantic beat of her own heart. The servant who had brought her bowed and retreated, the door clicking shut with a sound of finality. This was her moment, before he could speak. Before he could dismiss her back into the anonymous churn of his household, she had to seize it. "Your Grace," she began, her voice clear and steady, a stark contrast to the tremor in her hands which she clenched at her sides. "Lord Harrington will be ruined tonight." He turned slowly, his expression one of bored contempt. "You are dismissed. He intends to make an announcement at his ball," she pressed on, the words she had rehearsed in the dark of the coach now tumbling out. "A grand venture, a partnership with the Meridian Trading Company, promising returns of 50%. He will claim their last 3 ships. The Ethelred, the Sovereign Star, and the Dawn Chaser have just docked in London. Heavy with spices and silk, there holds proof of his imminent wealth." The Duke's eyes narrowed. A flicker of something beyond boredom, annoyance perhaps, crossing his features. He said nothing, so she continued, laying out the architecture of the lie with the precision of an architect who had been forced to build it. "The ships are real. Their cargo is not. Their holds are filled with ballast and cheap water-damaged timber, disguised under a layer of scentless spice sacks. The Meridian Company is a phantom. Its offices a rented room and its staff, actors paid for the day. The money he has gathered from his investors, including, I suspect, several of your own allies in Parliament, is not invested. It is sitting in a private account, under the name Silas Finch, which he will attempt to access before fleeing to the continent at first light." She saw the shift in him then. The skepticism was still there, a fortress wall, but her words were a sapper's tunnel, undermining it with undeniable granular detail. How could a circus seer know the names of ships, the alias of a secret account, the specific damning emptiness of their cargo? "You spin a fanciful tale," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Harrington is a fool, but not a criminal of such ambition. He is a desperate man, Serafina countered, her gaze unwavering. And desperation makes men ambitious. The collapse will be public. It will be absolute. And when it happens, you will know that everything else I have told you is also true. The conspiracy is not his alone. He is a pawn, a flashy distraction. The real players are still in the shadows, and they will move again, soon. The Duke walked to his desk, his fingers tracing its polished edge as he circled her. He was a predator assessing new prey. And you expect me to believe this? Based on the word of a woman who tells fortunes with a crystal ball? I expect you to listen to the evidence, she said, her composure beginning to fray under his intense scrutiny. I was their seer, their oracle. I saw the documents, I heard the plans. They thought my visions were a useful tool for manipulating the superstitious, and they were careless in my presence. They forgot that a woman who is not considered a person is often not considered a threat. I remember everything. He stopped in front of her, his cold gaze pinning her in place. A convenient memory, and a convenient prediction for an event I cannot verify until the morning. You will not have to wait until morning, she whispered. As if summoned by her words, a frantic knock echoed through the study. Before the Duke could respond, the doors burst open. His steward, a man usually carved from marble composure, stood breathless on the threshold, his face ashen. Your Grace. A message from the Harrington ball. It is chaos. The Duke's head snapped toward the man. Explain. Lord Harrington, the steward stammered. He made his announcement just as the young woman said. But before the toasts were finished, a group of bailiffs and creditors stormed the ballroom. The ships are empty. The company does not exist. His accounts are frozen. He was arrested in the middle of the dance floor, in front of everyone. The steward's eyes flickered to Serafina for a terrified instant, as if she were the source of the calamity. They are calling it the greatest financial scandal of the season. His name is utterly ruined. The silence that fell was heavier than any shout. The Duke dismissed the steward with a sharp, silent gesture. The door closed, leaving the two of them alone once more in the fire-lit room. He did not look at her with triumph, or gratitude, or even newfound respect. The calculation she had seen in the coach was back, but it was different now. It was deeper, hungrier. He was no longer looking at a locked box. He was looking at the key. He slowly moved to stand behind his desk, his hands flat on the dark wood, his gaze a physical weight upon her. It would seem, he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated in the very air, that my household has acquired a new asset. He did not smile. The word asset felt more binding than any chain. You will remain here. You will tell me everything, starting with the names of the players in the shadows. Serafina met his stare, the grim satisfaction of her prediction warring with a fresh, chilling dread. She had proven her value, but in this gilded cage value was not a shield. It was a leash. The first skirmish had been hers, but the war for her future and for the truth she carried had just begun in earnest. The truth of her words settled between them, a quiet verdict. So you see, Serafina concluded, the ledgers were merely the key. The lock was their own greed, and the door now opens to a far different future. The Duke did not interrupt, his stillness more unnerving than any outburst. He was a man reassembling a shattered puzzle, and she was the piece that rendered the old image obsolete. The ledgers, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, which she kept folded in her lap. I secreted them out over the course of a year. A page tucked into a book, a sheet lining a trunk. They thought me too grief-stricken, too simple to understand the columns of numbers I was ordered to transcribe. She gestured to the small, worn journal she had placed on the corner of his desk. That contains the key, the false shipments, the inflated valuations, the payments to fictitious investors. Baron Thorne was the architect, but my late husband and his partner were the public face, the charming fools who drew in the capital. The Baron provided the legitimacy, and when the scheme grew too large to sustain, he planned to let them take the fall. He believed himself insulated. She watched him process this, his eyes never leaving her. The arrest of the Baron, the ruin of his reputation and finances, was not just a piece of news. It was a demonstration of her reach, her patience, her lethality. The checkmate was complete. The antagonists were defeated by the very woman they considered a worthless pawn. And why reveal this to me? the Duke finally asked, his tone devoid of inflection. You had your vengeance. You could have vanished into the city with this knowledge. A ghost haunting the ruins you created. A ghost has no protection, Serafina replied, the grim satisfaction in her chest cooling into pragmatic ice. The Baron has allies, men who profited in the shadows and will now seek to silence the source of their discomfort. And a woman alone with no name and no fortune is easily silenced. I needed a fortress. You needed a weapon. Our interests for the moment are aligned. A slow, deliberate smile, devoid of any warmth, touched the Duke's lips. It was the expression of a predator recognizing a new and fascinating species of prey. A fortress, he mused, pushing himself from the desk and circling it until he stood before her. He did not touch her, but his presence was a cage. You mistake my home for a sanctuary. It is an arsenal, and you have just volunteered your services as an armorer. He picked up the journal, not with reverence, but with the clinical assessment of a general inspecting a new map of enemy territory. You will remain here, as I said. You will have a room not in the servants' quarters, but adjacent to the library. You are neither guest nor staff. You are a consultant. Your first consultation begins now. He leaned back against the desk, folding his arms. The names in the shadows. The Baron's allies. Give me one. This was the test. The leash, as she had feared, was being fitted. To give him a name was to hand him a thread that could unravel a whole section of the city's power structure, and in doing so, bind her fate irrevocably to his. Her value was not just in what she knew, but in what she could lead him to. Serafina met his gaze, the firelight catching the flecks of gold in her otherwise dark eyes. Lord Castwell, she said, the name dropping like a stone into the quiet room. He never invested directly. His contributions were political. He ensured certain parliamentary inquiries were delayed, that certain port authorities looked the other way. His reward was a percentage of the profits from the Silk Road shipments that never contained any silk. The Duke's eyes narrowed in recognition. Castwell was a powerful man, a fixture at court, a wolf in statesman's clothing. Proof? In the ledger, coded as CW consultancy fees. The amounts and dates correspond with the stifling of two separate investigations by the Trade Commission. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and the calculation in his gaze was so intense it felt like a physical pressure. He was no longer just seeing a key to a single lock. He was seeing a master locksmith who could open every door in the city. The financial scandal she had engineered was not an end, but a beginning. It was a crack in the wall, and the Duke of Ashworth was a man who knew how to widen a crack into a chasm. Very well, he said, his voice a low hum. From this moment you are under my protection, and you are my responsibility. You will continue your work. I want a full analysis of every transaction, every coded entry. I want to know not just who they are, but what they fear, what they covet, where their weaknesses lie. He paused, his head tilting. You have a keen mind, Serafina. Do not mistake this reprieve for freedom. The world believes you to be a victim, a minor casualty of your husband's folly. It is a useful fiction. We will maintain it. To the outside world, you are my charity case. A widow I have taken in out of pity for your connection to the scandal that so publicly vindicated my own cautions. The words were a carefully crafted prison, gilded and secure. She had traded the overt threat of the Baron for the subtle, far more dangerous custody of the Duke. He owned her secrets now, and in doing so, he owned her. I understand, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I doubt you do, he replied, pushing off the desk and turning toward the fire, dismissing her. But you will rest now. The library will be your workshop starting tomorrow. Do not leave this wing without my express permission. As she rose and moved silently toward the door, his voice stopped her one last time. Serafina, she turned, her hand on the cold brass doorknob. The game you played with the Baron was checkmate, he said, not looking at her, his profile sharp and unmoving against the flames. The game you have just entered with me, it has no such simple end. It is a game of infinite moves. See that you remember which board you now play on. She slipped out, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft final click. The hallway was dark and cold. She had won her vengeance. She had secured her survival. But as she stood alone in the immense, silent house, Serafina felt no triumph. She had proven her value, and in doing so, had made herself the most prized and perilous possession of the most dangerous man she had ever known. The war had indeed begun, and the first battle had merely determined the general to whom she would be indentured. The silence in the study was a physical presence, thick with the ashes of her confession. Serafina stood, her body a rigid column of spent adrenaline, and watched him. She had poured the entire sordid truth into the space between them. The intercepted letters that revealed the Baron's plot to bankrupt the Duke and seize his northern holdings. The frantic flight from her own wedding that had branded her a fickle coward, the 12 long months of living in shadows, forging the evidence that would publicly exonerate the Duke and destroy the Baron. She had laid her soul bare on his desk, a final, desperate gamble. And he was breaking. The Duke of Westmere did not move, but the imperious ice that perpetually glazed his features shattered. His sharp, intelligent eyes, which usually assessed the world with detached calculation, now churned with a storm of unwelcome emotions. Shock first, at the sheer audacity of her single-handed crusade. Then a slow, dawning horror as the pieces of the past year realigned themselves. Each of his own cold assumptions about her flightiness, her betrayal, her weakness, twisting into a grotesque mockery of the truth. He had seen her as a casualty, then a culprit, when all along she had been a clandestine general in his own war. His gaze lifted from the empty space where her words still hung and settled on her. The storm in his eyes coalesced into something else, something raw and unsettling, a profound, humbling respect. He had built his life and his fortune on a foundation of impeccable logic and controlled risk, and she had just proven herself a variable beyond any calculation. She was chaos with a purpose, a tempest he had mistaken for a drizzle. Without a word, he turned and walked to his mahogany desk. From a locked drawer, he retrieved a single sheet of parchment, the crisp vellum stark in the firelight. Serafina's breath hitched. It was her indenture contract, the document that legally bound her to his service as a lowly secretary, the symbol of the gilded cage he had built for her out of a misjudgment. He did not look at her as he crossed back to the hearth. He held the corner of the parchment to the flames. The fire, ever hungry, licked at the edge, the paper blackening and curling as the orange glow consumed his signature, the official seal, the very terms of her servitude. A fragile, flaking skeleton of the document rose for a moment before collapsing into embers on the log. He watched it until nothing remained but smoke. The act was absolute. It was an apology he would never speak, an admission of fault his pride would never allow to pass his lips. But it was real. The legal chains were gone. He finally turned to face her, the fire at his back, casting his face in shadow. But she could still see the new, unsettling intensity in his expression. The respect was there, yes, but it was now fused with a fierce, possessive curiosity. He had not just burned a contract. He had incinerated the old dynamic. The charity case was gone. What stood before him was an equal in cunning, a peer in resolve. "It would seem," he said, his voice a low murmur that vibrated in the quiet room, "I have been housing a dragon in my dovecote, and mistaking its fire for a trick of the light." Serafina found her voice, though it was thin. "I only sought to right a wrong." "You sought vengeance," he corrected, his tone not accusatory but factual. "And you achieved it with an elegance I can only admire. But you have created a new problem, Serafina, for both of us." He stepped closer, and she resisted the urge to retreat. The space felt charged, dangerous. "The Baron is broken, but his allies are not. They will be looking for the source of the leak, for the hand that guided the knife. Your hand. The fiction of you as my pitied widow is now more vital than ever, but it is also more fragile. They will be watching you, and by extension they will be watching me with renewed interest." He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her, as if seeing her for the first time. The simple grey dress she wore seemed suddenly flimsy, a poor disguise for the formidable creature beneath. "The contract is ash," he stated, "but your position here is not. It has merely evolved. You are no longer my indentured secretary. You are my guest, my protected, secret, and exceedingly valuable guest." He was offering her a new cage, one with velvet walls, but a cage nonetheless. Freedom was an illusion. She knew that now. The world outside his protection was a hunting ground. "I understand," she said, the words tasting different on her tongue than they had the night he first laid down his rules. Then, they had been a surrender. Now they were an acknowledgement of a new, more complex battlefield. "I doubt you do," he replied, a ghost of his old arrogance returning, but it was tempered. "But you will. Your work in the library begins tomorrow as planned. But its purpose has changed. You will not be cataloging my past. You will be helping me navigate the future. We are going to find the Baron's allies before they find us." He was not setting her free. He was recruiting her. He gestured toward the door, a clear dismissal. As she moved past him, the scent of sandalwood and burnt parchment filling her senses, his voice halted her. "Serafina," she turned, her hand on the cold brass doorknob. "The game you played with the Baron was checkmate," he said, not looking at her, his profile sharp and unmoving against the flames. "But the contest you have entered with me is a perpetual game, one with no final move, only an endless series of plays and consequences. See that you remember which board you now play on." She slipped out, the heavy door closing behind her with a soft final click. The hallway was dark and cold, but a new kind of fire was kindling within her. She had won her vengeance, she had secured her survival. But as she stood alone in the immense, silent house, Serafina felt the weight of his gaze even through the oak door. He had seen her, truly seen her, and in that seeing had laid claim to a part of her no contract could ever have bound. The war had indeed begun, and the first battle had not determined her general. It had forged a pact between two rival powers, and she knew with a thrilling and terrifying certainty that their alliance would be the most perilous game of all. The public vindication was a masterstroke, a tapestry woven with such cunning threads of truth and suggestion that London society absorbed it without question. The Duke, a man whose influence was a quiet, tectonic force, did not shout her exoneration from the rooftops. He whispered it in the right clubs, planted it in the most reputable papers, and let it simmer in the drawing rooms of the powerful. Serafina, the narrative went, had not fled in disgrace but had undertaken a perilous, self-appointed mission to infiltrate the traitorous Baron's circle. Her silence a necessary sacrifice for the greater good of the crown. She was hailed not as a fallen woman, but as a quiet patriot. Her name, once a hissed insult, was now spoken with a reverent curiosity. Her mother's inheritance, once a distant dream locked in a legal vault, was restored to her with surprising speed, a feat she knew was not accomplished by the law's natural momentum, but by the Duke's unseen hand. She accepted it all with a grace that felt like a new kind of armor. She took a modest but elegant house on a quiet square, not in the glaring heart of the ton, but on its periphery, a position that allowed her to observe without being fully consumed. She became a quietly influential figure, a woman whose opinion was sought on matters of art, and in hushed tones on matters of business, her sharp mind no longer a hidden weapon but a polished tool. The Duke did not come to her for a week. When he did, it was not with a summons but with a note, asking if he might call at her convenience. The formality was a language they both understood, a new lexicon for their new game. He arrived bearing no lavish gifts, only a single rare botanical text he thought might interest her. He was different. The arrogance that had once been a wall around him was now a doorway he consciously held open. His courtship was not one of grand gestures or possessive declarations, but of quiet, consistent presence. He sought her opinions and, for the first time, genuinely listened to the answers. He spoke to her of his estates, his investments, the labyrinthine politics of Parliament, not as a master informing a subordinate, but as a strategist consulting an equal. He was humbled, not by failure but by revelation. The woman he had purchased, thinking he owned her spirit as he owned his horses and his houses, had proven to possess a will and an intellect that mirrored his own. He saw the fire in her, the same fire that had engineered a checkmate against the Baron, and he knew that to try and contain it was to be burned. The contract of ownership had been incinerated in the crucible of their confrontation. Her freedom, which he had once bought as the ultimate act of possession, was now a gift he freely offered, a treasure laid at her feet in the desperate hope that she would see fit to share it with him. One afternoon, as a soft rain pattered against the windows of her drawing room, he broached the subject directly. "They expect a proposal," he said, his gaze on the steam rising from his tea. "The gossips. They believe this courtship follows a predictable path." Serafina watched him, her own cup steady in her hand. "And does it?" He looked up then, and his eyes held none of their former coldness. They were the color of a winter sky, clear and vast. "No, I am not here to follow a path, Serafina. I am here to walk beside you, if you will allow it. The alliance we forged was one of necessity. What I seek now is one of choice. Your choice." His words hung in the air, a tangible thing. She felt the weight of them, the immense significance of this powerful man offering not a command, but an invitation. He was not trying to win her. He was asking to be chosen by her. It was a more potent form of seduction than any diamond or declaration of love could ever be. Yet, as she looked at him, this man who had seen the darkest, most vengeful parts of her soul and had not flinched, but had instead recognized a kindred spirit, she felt the echo of his last warning in the library, a game of infinite moves. This courtship, this gentle, honest pursuit, was part of that game. It was a move on a board that encompassed not just the Baron's hidden allies, but the very structure of their lives, their positions in society, and the treacherous landscape of their own hearts. She set her cup down, the china clicking softly against the saucer. "They are still out there," she said, her voice low. "The Baron's allies. You said we would find them before they found us. This peace we are building here, it is a facade, is it not? A beautiful, necessary stage set for the next act." A slow, genuine smile touched his lips, a sight so rare it felt like a secret she had been entrusted with. "It is," he admitted without hesitation. "The work in the library continues. The threads we follow are thin, but they are there. This life you are building, the respect you are earning, it makes you safer and it makes you a more valuable player. Our partnership must appear to the outside world to have mellowed into this." He gestured between them at the quiet domesticity of the scene. "A reformed duke and his remarkable lady. It is the perfect camouflage." "So this is still a war," she stated. "It is," he replied. "But we are no longer rival powers. We are a single front, and every choice we make, including the choice of whether to stand together beyond the battlefield, is part of the campaign." He rose to leave, and she walked him to the door. As he stood on her threshold, a guest in her home, he took her hand, not to kiss it, but simply to hold it. His grasp was firm, warm. "The freedom is real, Serafina," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The choice is yours. Everything else is merely the board on which we play." He left, and she closed the door, leaning against it for a long moment. The house was silent, hers in a way nothing had ever been before. She felt the thrilling, terrifying certainty of his words. He had given her back her life, not as it was, but as it could be. He had offered her a partnership, a shared future, not as a possession, but as an equal. And in doing so, he had created the most exquisite, most dangerous trap of all. One made entirely of trust, respect, and the intoxicating promise of a shared destiny. She was free to refuse him, to walk away from the game and the man. But as she stood there, the ghost of his touch still on her hand, Serafina knew with a clarity that shook her to her core that she did not want to. The most perilous game was not the one against their hidden enemies. It was the one she was now playing with her own heart.